The title of the presentation was had to do with precautionary principle. I'm not going to directly deal with precautionary principle. I think Dr. Gondar did an excellent job of that couldn't be improved upon. What I want to talk a little bit about is debunking myths and how you communicate with people who are willing to be educated. There are, of course, people who aren't willing to be educated, their minds are made up, and we can actually do ourselves more damage with people like that than we can do ourselves favors. And just as Dr. Gondar said, our own marketing campaigns actually are classic shooting ourselves in the foot. Case there. In fact, I almost had a slide of a picture of somebody shooting themselves in the foot, and I didn't, but I do have something similar. I found this quote, I liked it. If a consumer doesn't want food produced by mainstream agriculture, he or she can buy organic. That's great. So what's hurtful to society at large is being led down a path that suggests that the food we're buying, there's something wrong with the food that we're buying currently from conventional agriculture. That's what I have an issue with. Demand for organic food is a market to be served, and we should be serving that market. There's money to be made. And of course, whenever you're selling something, the customer is always right. However, the customer deserves to have factual information, and educating the customer is a good thing, and it's necessary. In the case of the issues we're facing with organic production, context is one of the key things. People need to be provided with context because they don't have that. Claims about organic agriculture is that it's safer, greener, more humane, more nutritious and healthier, it's a higher quality product, and it's cheap. Especially people look at backyard production. They say, oh, I'm going to get a flock of chickens, produce my own eggs, produce my own meat. They find out pretty quick that the people that do it by the millions can do it cheaper. Is organic safer? What's the evidence? People say, well, it's got to be safer. No chemicals and pesticides. No antibiotics, no hormones, no genetically modified organisms. And it's bacteriologically cleaner because the animals are all out in this paradise, this green pasture paradise. I like this chemophobia. I found a paper on chemophobia. Chemical in modern society now, the word chemicals become this emotional trigger word. It's meant to drive emotional reactions. I hope I don't offend anybody here. If anybody here is a journalist, but modern journalism, well, maybe all journalism has always been this way, is designed to drive emotional responses. Not first to inform, but to drive an emotional response. If anybody in here has ever talked to a reporter, for any reason, you'll almost always, the very first thing they'll ask you is, how does X, Y, and Z make you feel? That's what they're all about. They're always going to say, how does this make you feel? Or how should this make people feel? So it's all about emotion. So people who are activists for some cause always want to drive an emotional response. With regard to chemicals, people believe that because there's that organic food has no chemicals, that there's no chemicals used in organic production. And that's really not true. Organic production does use pesticides and fungicides. For instance, rotenol is approved for organic, or was. I think it still is. It is in Europe. What's more toxic than rotenol? At least to fish. I mean, you put that stuff. We have our fisheries people frequently rotenol ponds to clean out undesirable species or to survey the fish in the pond. Rotenol is a natural product. It's plant derived, but holy smoke! I mean, is there anything much more toxic than rotenol? And there's other pesticides allowed in organic production. As long as they're from a natural source, those are easily allowed. One, though, that I wish there is from a natural source that we don't get anymore is blackleaf 40. Anybody here ever use blackleaf 40 for mites and birds? Great stuff. Can't use that anymore. But that was actually dangerous, though. It's nicotine, very concentrated nicotine, and it can be absorbed through the skin. If anybody here has ever picked tobacco before, especially cropping the sand lugs at the bottom of tobacco plants, If you're not a smoker or a chewer, you get sick from the tobacco and from the nicotine absorbed through your skin. But the point is that there are many potent pesticide and bioactive chemicals that occur naturally. All these plant alkaloids, like nicotine, caffeine, the opioids, all those things are pesticides produced by the plants. So pesticides are out there in the environment. We're swimming in a soup of various pesticides produced by the plants living around us all the time. Studies looking at chemical residues in organic foods have found that both organic and conventional poultry and other food products have very low or no residues of pesticides. They're almost never found in levels that are considered by the FDA to be of concern. However, organic production, because they're using less potent pesticides, has to use more of them. They tend to apply much more chemical than conventional agriculture. Not a human health concern as far as I can see. However, it does have an impact on the environment. Of course, sustainability is the new religion. There's a poster in my building at Auburn. We have a sustainability program on campus, of course, and somebody wrote, it was culture of sustainability. One of the students, bless their heart, took a Sharpie and marked out culture and wrote cult on that poster. And that's exactly what this has turned into. It's turned into religion. But using these natural pesticides has a greater impact on the environment and has higher levels of intrinsic toxic compounds in the crops. As crops, when plants are attacked by insects, they generally respond by producing more toxic compounds of their own. Even so far as, I remember reading a paper on, I think it was maple trees. A maple tree attacked by a pest will actually give off chemicals that cause other maple trees around it and other trees around it to up their levels of tannins and other toxic compounds in the trees to ward off insect damage to those. I wish our pine trees would do that. Oh, beetle damage. I've had hundreds of trees fall on my place. We forget this guy. He lived in the 1500s. He went by the name Paracelsus. His actual name was actually about that long, his real name. But he came up with the phrase, or he's credited with the phrase, the dose makes the poison. The difference between an edible plant and a non-edible plant is not that one has toxic compounds and the other doesn't. It's the amount of toxic compounds. Domestic plants have been bred to have low levels, but they're still there. So the precautionary principle would say we can't eat anything. And then the whole thing with hormones and hormone labeling. No hormones administered, no synthetic hormones. Of course, federal law prohibits the use of hormones in hogs and poultry. So the use of any hormone-free label is a marketing ploy, and it's intended to mislead consumers into thinking that the product is different and therefore worth a higher price. And as Dr. Gonder said, there is that little microscopic disclaimer on packages. I've even seen this in newspaper ads now for local grocery stores, because we have grocery stores that have got their own brand of organic chicken. No hormones? Well, we're in a sea of hormones. If you think we're in a sea of pesticides from alkaloids and things from plants, and probably half of us in the room here had caffeine this morning, and there's a pesticide that we took in voluntarily, because it does have an intoxicating effect to it, has an effect on the physiology. What about hormones? There's even more hormones out there. When I was a graduate student at NC State, we had a lab out on the farm. We'd do estrogen assays. On days that they cut grass, you couldn't do estrogen assays. When they would mow that lawn, it had a lot of clover in it. All the plant estrogens that were volatilized when they mowed that lawn would blank our estrogen assays in the lab. And the other thing is if female techs were doing the assays, we had to make sure they wore masks, because just breathing or talking over the assays, even the tiniest bit of saliva from a female would blank out an estrogen RIA. So we're just living in a world of hormones. 1.9 nanograms, this is not poultry, but 1.9 nanograms of estrogen and residue in a piece of beef from a cow that was implanted was a pellet. A human child, a non-reproductively active, prepubescent human child will produce 50,000 nanograms of estrogen per day. There's 1.9 nanograms in a 3-ounce serving of implanted beef. An adult human female, non-pregnant, 480,000 nanograms of estrogen a day. One birth control pill, which is a right that for every woman that has a right to a birth control pill. We can't tread on that. It's an absolute matter of faith. But one birth control pill, 350,000 nanograms of estrogen. And don't get me started on estrogen replacement therapies. My wife's postmenopausal. 225,000 nanograms of estrogen in potatoes. 340 nanograms of estrogen in peas. 520 in ice cream. 2,000 nanograms in cabbage. These are plant estrogens of varying potencies. Soy milk has quite a lot of estrogen in it. 170,000 nanograms of estrogen in soybean oil. All these are based on the same serving sizes. The soy estrogens, I had a graduate student doing a lot of work on soy estrogens, and of course her literature work, she found that these soy estrogens don't seem to be very well absorbed or not transferred in breast milk very well. Now, Asian populations consume a lot of soy, traditionally have. Doesn't seem to hurt them. In fact, they have lower levels of breast cancer and reproductive cancers in general. Whether that's associated with soy or not, who knows? But the correlation's there. However, in Western societies, we tend to feed children a lot of soy-based infant formulas and not breastfeed. In an Asian society where people are eating soy constantly, their infants don't have these soy phytoestrogens in their blood in high levels because it's not transferred to breast milk. In Western societies where we don't eat much soy, we're feeding babies soy-based infant formulas, and they have huge levels of these soy estrogens in their blood. Now there's a concern. That's an unregulated, uncontrolled experiment looking at estrogens in what the activists like to call a highly susceptible population. Antibiotic residues, antibiotic resistance. I'm not going to go any further with that. Dr. Gondar said more than I can say about it. Genetically modified organisms. I like to make the point to my students that all domestic species are genetically modified. By definition, that's the definition of domestic. They're genetically modified to suit human purpose through selective breeding, through natural mutation. We look for animals' mutations. And we've also, for years, going back for 100 years, induced mutations through chemicals. And we still do that for plant crops. We still induce mutations chemically or by radiation. Out in the real world, genes are swapped by organisms willy-nilly. There's genes swapped between unrelated bacteria. There are organisms that will splice their genes into yours. In fact, we probably all have benefited from having, the human race has benefited from having genes spliced into our genome that's driven our development. Using genetically modified species to date have reduced energy and chemical inputs in croplands and reduced environmental degradation. But the activists are against them. And can't be organic. You'd think that genetically modified would be the keystone to organic production, because you can genetically modify organisms so that you don't have to use pesticides and things like that. Is organic greener? More sustainable? Does it have a lower carbon footprint? Well, it doesn't seem to. Organic farming practices use less synthetic pesticides. Okay, but they use their own chemicals that are still ecologically damaging. They refuse to endorse technologies that reduce or eliminate the use of these altogether. They specifically forbid the use of GMOs, which should be the best thing that ever happened to organic production. Studies, now, if anybody wants references for any of this stuff I'm talking about, I'll be glad to provide them. I've got a whole list of research references that back this stuff up. Studies out there support that organic farming usually does support more biodiversity on cropland. Now, a lot of that biodiversity is pests, I'm afraid. My wife's cousin has organic cotton production in eastern North Carolina. The first year they started the organic cotton production, went great. The best crop of cotton it was indistinguishable from their regular, conventionally grown cotton. The second year, not quite so good. Third year, bugs ate all their organic cotton completely, wiped them out. So now they checkerboard the organic cotton in amongst their conventionally grown cotton. I'm not exactly sure that's kosher with regard to organic production, but it's the only way they can get a crop. But organic does not have a positive impact per unit of production. Obviously, we take an efficiency hit. Organic milk, cereals, and pork literature shows that they all generated higher greenhouse emissions per unit of product than conventionally farmed counterparts. Although organic beef did have lower emissions in some cases. In general, organic products required less energy input, but these studies showed that more land was needed than the same quantity of conventionally reared products. Is organic more nutritious? Is it healthier? There are several analyses out there, most recently the Stanford analysis, that looked at about 2,000 studies in the literature of the nutritional content and safety of organic food. They could find that study's been roundly attacked by the activists, by the organic activists. Although I'm not really sure why they can't have read the paper if they're attacking it. The paper is generally favorable toward organic production, but the overall conclusion of the study is that the literature has no evidence that organic food is healthier or more nutritious. It doesn't say that it's not, it just says in 2,000 studies in the literature, none of them show a significant difference in the nutritional value or safety of the food. Food is food. Okay, cleaner, obviously organic production generally is not either an animal or crop production. I've heard people joke that organic is a code word for grown in manure. So there you go. Blind taste tests have never been able to discriminate between organic and conventionally produced foods, assuming that you're looking at the same strain of chicken or tomato or whatever, that it was harvested the same way, the same degree of ripeness. That's one of the problems with comparing organic with conventionally produced crops of any kind. How do you control for strain, for things like, you pick a tomato one day early or one day late, it makes a tremendous difference, whether it's organic or not. So it's very difficult to do these kind of comparisons in any meaningful way. I'm not going to talk about the humane stuff because I'm already way over time, I think. But there's no evidence that organic is any more humane, probably less, partly for reasons Dr. Yonders already spoke about. The health of the animals can be significantly compromised by organic production practices. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of a lot of, or ever been around free-range broiler farms like that, where they have the houses with doors in the side and a big fenced lot. There's never any, the birds are never out there. And I saw a picture of some farms, or a farm in the UK, and outside every little door though, where the chickens go, there was a big plastic owl. The farmer had put a plastic owl outside every one of those doors so the birds would take a look out there. It's like, no. We did a range turkey study at Auburn a few years back. And the very first turkey we released out into the lot, we did have the foresight to put netting over top. The very first turkey poult that we set out there in that lot went running out into the grass, and 30 seconds later a hawk hit that netting. Bam. We got a red-tailed hawk all the time. We had to go and disentangle a red-tailed hawk out of the netting. With 30 seconds, that's all it took. Okay, and I want to talk about psychology real briefly if I can. Why debunking these myths is so difficult. Several papers I read talked about inadvertent effects or backfire effects. There's three primary backfire effects when you're trying to debunk something that's a widely held belief. The familiarity backfire, overkill backfire, and worldview backfire. To debunk a myth, you got to talk about it. The more you talk about it, the more familiar people are with it. It will end up reinforcing the myth, even though you're telling people that the myth is just that. All they remember is hormones. If you say there's no hormones in poultry, what they're going to come away with is, we said something about hormones. Yeah, okay, so it's those damn hormones in poultry. Studies were done, one where they tested people for this. They gave them a lecture on debunking all this stuff about vaccines and autism and danger of vaccines, showing people the data that vaccines don't cause diseases and not a risk. They gave them a test afterwards. People did great. They gave them the same test 30 minutes later. They were back to where they were, believing the myths again, except they scored worse. They forgot everything, but they still remembered the myth. So debunking can reinforce a myth if you're not careful. To avoid that, what you do is you start the discussion by not talking about the myth. You start off right from the beginning in reinforcing the information that you want people to have. Your goal is to increase people's familiarity with the facts. Here's an example. You start off, you emphasize the core facts. Say, selective breeding and excellent nutrition allows modern poultry to grow quickly and efficiently. No talk about hormones at all there. Then you go a little deeper with it. Talk about poultry breeding efforts since the 1920s and how we've seen incremental improvement. Birds didn't one day just jump up to high growth levels. It came on gradually. After you've done that, then you can mention the myth. You say, well, here's how we're doing it, but there's still this myth out there about growth hormones and hormones. And you don't want people to feel like that they're stupid for believing the myth. You got to avoid that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So you bring in the myth, and we're shooting, as Dr. Garner said, we're shooting ourselves in the foot because we use this in marketing that we're in all our advertising, no hormones. So that right there goes back to this. Instead of putting out the message that it's breeding nutrition, we say, oh, well, we don't use hormones, but that just reinforces the myth. The overkill backfire, which I'm probably dreadfully guilty of right now. The common wisdom is the more counter arguments you provide, the more information you provide, the more successful you're going to be. It's not the case. People have short attention spans, they're busy, and most people aren't going to understand an egghead, pointy head like me when I get up and start using scientific terms and all. You want to refute a myth, less can be more. Generating 3 arguments is better than coming in with a dozen arguments that nobody's going to listen to or understand. Keep content simple, use simple language, short sentences, emphasize subheadings, paragraphs, avoid dramatic language and derogatory comments because that just turns people off, alienates them. Sticking to the facts and using graphics really helps if they're not too complicated. You can show this to people, and I did show this to a group on a lecture about that involved discussing hormones in poultry just a week or so ago. I said, from 1920 to the 2000s, this is the way the growth of poultry has increased. Exactly where in this did we start using hormones? It's like you don't see any obvious jump in the growth rate. So what this shows you, what you should get from this, is that it was gradual and incremental. It wasn't something we added to the feed one day and suddenly got all this. And I got a lot of really good positive comments about that. I had a couple dozen students say, now I get it. Now, the worldview backfire, and that's the most potent of them. People have a certain sense of themselves based on what they believe. Their identity is wrapped up in these things. The causes they find themselves drawn to has a lot to do with their personal identity. When people are strongly fixed in their views, a counter argument just causes them to retrench. They're not going to budge. You present an argument that directly conflicts with those views will very often causes people to strengthen their views. It's called confirmation bias. One of the forms of that is confirmation bias. If you give people information, they'll pick and choose what out of that they're going to believe. If what you're giving them doesn't agree with what they already believe, they'll ignore it. They'll disallow it. There's also what's called disconfirmation bias, and that's ignoring the information that runs counter. They'll take what reinforces their beliefs and ignore anything that goes against that. And it's funny because the authors of the paper that I got some of this from actually exhibit exactly those biases all through their examples in the book. It's called the Debunking Manual or something like that. But they have tremendous biases that they don't bother to disguise at all. But what this means is outreach should be directed toward the undecided majority. There's people we're never going to reach. And we're wasting our time to talk to them. We just reinforce the myths in their mind. But the undecided majority is who we need to be speaking to, and that's most of the public. Information can be presented in ways that reduce psychological resistance. Something called self-affirmation. You don't just attack somebody for believing there's hormones in poultry. You say, considering how these birds grow, and all the stuff that's in the press about athletes using anabolic steroids, it's easy to understand how you might think that we're using antibiotics or hormones in poultry. But then you go back and tell them we do breeding, we know more about the nutrition of the chicken than any other animal, hormones are illegal. Then you can talk about the hormone myth. But you don't want to make people feel stupid about what they believe, then they'll just turn you off.